So welcome to the uvwasi team meeting for September 13th, 2023. We'll follow our standard approach of looking through the issues that were tagged onto the agenda. And in issue number 229. But before we get started on that, are there any announcements or news that people would like to share? I don't know, Oscar, if you mentioned that you were at, I think it was WasmCon.
Oh yeah, I suppose that could be news.
Yeah, maybe this is, I don't know if it's a perfect fit, but like maybe now's a good time to jump into that and then we can get on to the regular agenda items.
Sure. So last week at WasmCon, it was the entire conference was centered around the component model and WASI Preview 2 effectively. And so I think we saw a lot of really good just progress towards what Preview 2 is going to be. And I think there's a lot more clarity around it. And so I think from the perspective of uvwasi and node.js, I think we understand what we should be implementing moving forward. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. We have mentioned it before, but it's a little bit more solidified now, where I think node.js will definitely want to target the CLI world of Preview 2. So I think if we can just go ahead and just make that a firm stance, like this is going to be the world that Node.js provides, then I think it's going to make, well, not just make our own lives easier, but it also makes the most sense there. And it's a lot more straightforward to start porting Preview 1 stuff over to Preview 2 when we know that that's what we are aiming at supporting. Potentially, if Node.js wanted to support additional worlds outside of those, it could, but those don't necessarily need to be provided by the uvwasi project. So, for example, if we wanted to support the HTTP proxy world, that could be something that makes sense to just implement in pure JavaScript. And so I think this is something that Colin was a little bit worried about before, just with all the different worlds that might need to be supported. But I think from uvwasi's perspective, I think it makes sense to stick to the core feature set that exists there. There's some good simplifications with some issues we've struggled with, like around clocks and things like that. So I think, I don't know if we ever are just going to do a vote or just going to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. But I think that does make the most sense for us moving forward.
Is there do you have a link to like the docs for that world? That might be
yes, let me get that open.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point that even if Node makes sense for Node to support a number of worlds, they don't necessarily fit into uvwasi or have to.
Right. So here is, I'm just gonna post this and we'll put this in the notes. But this is the CLI world. And so the important thing to look at is if you open the wit folder and there's a command .wit. If you take a look at that, that's everything that is provided by this world. So important stuff: clocks, file system, sockets. They're slightly different because now we have the ability to create sockets, which we did not have before. But then the random and polling sort of all are exactly the same. Some of the stuff like environment, and stood in, stood out, those things are all exclusive to this world and not going to be provided by any of the other WASI worlds. So just, I think, not that it's particularly important, but just calling that out, that's a little bit different compared to how a lot of the other worlds work.
And I think it's also, if since we're on YouTube, if you're not used to the component model with definitions, the CLI world is a combination of all this stuff. Oscar just specifically said that some of the stuff is very specific to it. It's only provided by CLI. But if you see any of these WASI prefix ones,
Sorry, let me go back to that. I was where was it? The command, right? Okay. Yeah.
So we're anything with the WASI : prefix means we're pulling from other worlds, right? So in such, actually, does that mean that we support this too, Oscar? Like we support clocks, wall clock, or we just require that you provide clocks, wall clock?
We support it.
Okay. So yeah, so it's the CLI is a superset of these as well, right? So it's not like by saying CLI, we're not supporting file system because file system are on lines 7 and 8, right? So we are a superset of file system to provide CLI.
That's what I was kind of wondering, where are the file system functions defined here? I guess this is saying you need to go and look at WASI file system types and WASI file system pre-opens to.
And those are all specs. So if you look in the WebAssembly org on GitHub, pretty much all of these exist somewhere.
They also might be in depths there, like the WIT files might be in depths.
Oh, it's also possible, yeah.
I think
so if you go back,
in the depths.
Depths.
Yeah. So right now they're
yeah.
committing all the depths in here.
Yeah, so you'll be able to see everything here. There are going to be some more changes happening over the next couple of weeks. So it's not completely final just yet, but we can start moving towards this now if we would like.
So like, okay, let's just trying to like, where would the function be to read or write a file?
So click on the world.wit for file system.
Okay.
I think it might be an IO.
Oh yeah, it could just be an IO. I think they do define them in terms of streams.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's there's a read write and blocking versions of them as well. And so yeah, they did split out that functionality. I think file system is mostly just dealing with just the management of the files themselves, not necessarily like writing to them. And then everything else happens in terms of streams. And that's also going to be a breaking change in preview 3, but we don't have to worry about that right now.
Are the streams, so I guess I didn't hear this clarification. Is streams being redefined in terms of resources, or are they kind of set in how they are now?
I don't have a great answer for that. Other than it's going to be a first class type, but they're not right now.
I'm pretty sure streams are going to be resources by the end of the year.
Cool.
Okay, well that's definitely interesting if that like helps narrow the scope.
Yeah, it definitely does. I'll also call out the command world is going to be renamed to the CLI world. Just in case someone looks at this later and is a little bit confused at why some of the file names are different and why the name of the world is different.
But there might be I don't know what they call them, but CLI is like the top level world, but they might have a command and they might have a reactor, right? I think that's what Dan was saying. So command becomes CLI, but then we might have a sub namespace that is also command and then a new one that's reactor, right?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, naming will be different, but I think command and reactor actually mean something. So they don't want to collide with that name.
But yeah, that's the biggest thing from WasmCon is that we are moving forward on this. There was a vote last week to decide that this is in fact the way preview 2 is going. So we know for a fact that this is happening. And I believe they want to launch preview 2 by the end of the year. So we have a little bit of time, but I should just keep that in mind.
Okay. Anything else we should chat about on that before moving to the issues?
I imagine that's about it.
Okay, so the next one we have is the The issue in FD reader on M1, I don't think there's any update on that. I don't know why the tool didn't generate the right, didn't have the issue, except for maybe I think I put the wrong tag on it and then added the right tag. But anyway, for the next release, I have created the PR about an hour ago. So if somebody can jump in and approve that, I can go ahead and cut the release, which was one of the things we said last time we should do. PR open. The next issue is what's new in WASI. I think, there's nothing new. Actually, I think, once the release is cut, Michael will post about socket support. I'll put together something just to give an overview of that. So that goes out in the news. And then the last thing we kind of have on the agenda is changes to WASI spec snapshot and preview 2, which we kind of use as an opportunity if Guy has any updates that he wants to share in terms of his proof of concept or anything else on that front.
One thing I can do briefly is actually just present my slides from WasmCon where I spoke about the preview 2 implementation. And then that way I can just kind of share that section. And I think it'd be interesting in this context to discuss.
Yeah, sounds great.
I do have a hard stop at 11:30.
Okay, here's the link if you're interested. Just make sure it's the right one. Yep. And then I'm just going from slide 28. Can everybody see that? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was kind of, this comes after a demo section in the slides where I've sort of demonstrated loading like WASI and the WASI implementation in the browser and a WASI implementation in Node, which is a preview 2 implementation that at the moment is just very bare bones experimental, mostly to get demos working. And but then I talk about, I was able to just import a component or a module that's using this WASI interface, and through the ESM integration, it can just get access to it like ambiently. So I talk about this concept of like instancing versus ambient imports, which comes up in the component model a lot, because the component model has the ability to do first-class instantiations in WASM. And so I talk about this as a choice between the virtual platform layering, which again is something I demo in the talk, and the actual sort of ambient. So if you think of if I had a component that implements the CLI world, and if we had Node at the top level, I could point Node at that component and run it, and it would ambiently link into that component would import all the WASI interfaces. And Node.js would satisfy those imports. And so Node.js would be sort of resolving those imports in this component binary, effectively those imports being resolved being the sort of system usage. So that's, if you extend that to imagining, well, if it's not a CLI world with a run function, we also have this other thing called reactor worlds, where you don't have a run function, but you can have any function you want, but you can still access the file system, you can still access the network, etc. So it's a lot more like a library than it is like a CLI app that you run from beginning to end, and that's the sort of reactor. And so if you import a reactor, we should have the same implicit linkage against the ambient WASI in the ESM integration is my argument for that. And so I talk about the Node.js integration and sort of talk about how you can have both ambient linkage and instanced linkage. And I put this kind of example, not saying that this is like exactly how it should be, but just sort of an example of the sort of thing that would enable that, where you could have the sort of ambient interfaces available as like a singular module. And what enables this in the component model as opposed to preview one is that there doesn't need to be this extra ceremony around memory binding that you have with our current preview one system. And so what that means is you can have lots of binaries sharing the same WASI state. So they're sitting on the same WASI instance or the same kind of system. And that kind of allows us to have, like, you can load two things and they can share streams between each other because they're talking the same language, etc. So they're sitting on the same underlying ambient WASI interface. But then if you want to virtualize something, you want to say, actually, I don't want to give this access to the full file system. I want to create a, like we do exactly as we do currently in the WASI implementation. I create an instance of WASI and then pass the imports as an object. And then I'm going to do it as an instance, and it's not going to get, maybe I'll write my own implementation of, or set different capabilities or ban certain functions, or only have it giving access to the file system on, but everything else, the standard IO, I'm going to pipe into a separate, I'm going to do something else with it, or I'm going to give it a different clock or something like that. So you can sort of virtualize these things in the instancing model, but then still have this singular ambient kind of, what do you call it? I forget the term, but yeah, that's the, that was the overall section I had on Node.js, which I thought would just be nice to share and hear any thoughts on it. The API suggestion here is just like one way of doing it, but along those lines, what would be nice to see where we can have both those things due to the implicit and the explicit kind of differences in workflows. Any thoughts on that?
So the two options you show sort of on the right, the bottom one on the right is the existing one, right? Where you create your WASI, and
Exactly.
then the top one is the one that would be the ambient case.
Exactly. Yeah. So I probably actually should have made that the named export so that it's not like a breaking change. So yeah, it would just be that. That's probably the more correct version. Yeah. And then it matches what we currently have.
What do you see as the difference between an instanced version of WASI here and just doing a new WebAssembly.instance with the ambient functions as the imports?
Yeah, I guess what this is this is the ASM integration, right? So this is the WebAssembly ASM integration, which is the current spec for importing WebAssembly modules as a module from an ES module. And so when you get that first class integration into the module system, that's where you need the ambient WASI. If we haven't got the ASM integration in Node, we certainly don't need the ambient interface. So it's only with the ASM integration that you want it, because you're deferring your entire linkage, or you're, allowing the Node.js to handle the resolution.
And what do you mean by ASM integration? It's
that's the WebAssembly ASM integration is where is it? There we go. It's this specification for basically supporting the import of WASM. There isn't a nice example in the README, but basically, where's the spec there? Should be somewhere here. I forget where it is.
I think like I can. I guess what I'm wondering about is, what does that mean in terms of the threading model? Like, I think it was kind of clear in the other model where you created instance of WASI and you said run this, that when you ran that was basically taking over your thread loop and was blocking, right? Like nothing else would happen until you returned. Once you've got these things that you import, later on, they now look just like anything else you've imported, right? So like, but they might operate very differently, and or maybe they're not supposed to anymore. But that's kind of my question, is like, does it imply more than
Yeah, so
just that you can import them now?
I guess this is kind of longer term because yeah, there is a you know, the goal for the component model is that there can eventually be a lowering into the ASM integration. We may be able to sort of basically, okay, so the real reason is I've got some workflows which are with Jco, you can take a WebAssembly component and you can like convert it into JS modules. And so you would turn it into JavaScript modules that are then acting the same way as that module would have acted. And I guess with top level await, we can always do a nested instantiation. So if we need to, we can do that. And so the ambient thing only really comes into play maybe once we have the ASM integration. Yeah. But we should at least plan for it in the namespacing and have something there that can fit in, if that makes sense.
But I guess it's I'm just still, and maybe I'm not asking the right question, but I'm still wondering about like the threading model or the, you know, I think I'm guessing that it basically says like, let's import this WASM thing, just like a native module, right? Like you can import a native module from Node and it gives you some exports on an object. You can treat them just as if they're JavaScript, right? And behind the scenes, everything takes place to make that basically work. To do that with WASM, I'm thinking though that like there might be, you know, some implications in terms of like if they're always synchronous calls, then maybe it's the same. But if they're now going to be asynchronous calls, just wondering if there's more behind the scenes that's implied.
Yeah, I mean, so that's actually more. That's more related. So there is like a start function. But at the moment, the start function isn't really fleshed out in the component model to be able to do anything, so that you know you can't start. We don't kind of have that currently, where you can just start like doing work and things like that. As far as I'm aware, there is a start function, but it can't actually call imports, outside imports, and so but where that comes up, I think, is more, so you have like a library that's written as a component and it's got an export function, and that function is going to start doing network things and things that are asynchronous, but it's over the synchronous interface. So the things to bear in mind on that is, firstly, preview 3 is next year with the async support, and the goal is to do something that does integrate with JS promises. That whole story needs to be better figured out, and that's something that is being worked on. The more minds on it, the better. It's at the moment what we have is just a single poll one-off function in the WASI API, and that poll one-off, you have the, so the two fundamentals are polls and streams. And so streams, you create them, they're all indexed, and that's great. And then, but for polls, you create them and they sort of, you can have a poll for you know, various things like a timer or whatever. And when you do a poll one-off, you pass all the polls that you want to wait on, but the expectation for poll one-off is actually that it would block on the event loop. And so that's a sort of, effectively, we have a WASI function, and that's that effect. So if you have you export a function, and that function is going to go and do something in the network and then return the response, the expectation is that poll one-off is going to block on the network activity. So on the JS side, if it's a sync function, it's just going to block. When we get async next year, you'll be able to actually have something that's integrating with promises. It might still need some event loop integration on the poll one-off side, though I don't think it's going to be obvious how that plays out. And yeah, so that there are some complexities there with the event loop that is active work that getting more people involved in contributing to the discussion, I think, would be great on a lot of that. But yeah, that's kind of also one of the things that I'm working on quite a bit at the moment is, it's event loop spinning, and that's where like having first class WASI integration allows us to do that. Whereas because you can't do it from user land in JS, start spinning the event loop. It's like that. So that whole one of integration is critical.
Yeah, okay. I was kind of interested because like on the socket front, the implementation in uvwasi required like having its own loops
And this also
spinning
gets
those and all that kind of stuff.
Event loop distinctions. And I mean, I think is also a place where there's room for us to also give a lot of feedback into the process. So that's why it's really good that we're getting on top of these questions now, because, if there are techniques that are preferable with any of these things, we should be, bringing that up and thinking about these problems and getting that feedback into the process, especially as this async story is being worked out over the next 6 to 9 months.
I think for Node too, just, thing that comes in my mind is like, the model of is, maybe you still want like a thread loop per WASM thing you're running, because like otherwise you're sharing across environments.
Yeah.
And we have that through worker threads and stuff, but
yeah. So would that sort of be something that we could parameterize on the instancing of our WASI instances? Like, do we have the ability to create a new thread loop, thread pool?
I think like today we would say create a new thread, and then within that create a new worker, and within that new worker you would do like create me a WASI instance. Okay, run this code in that WASI instance, right? And that will give it. Now today we don't necessarily use that thread loop because the methods are either synchronous or we've got a separate thread loop that we've used in uvwasi to pull on. But if we wanted to integrate with the node thread loops, then you would integrate somehow with the one in that worker thread.
Yeah, that is very much the standard technique for this stuff, and then you're not at least walking up the main thread. One issue we do have there is that well, I guess you are blocking up the main thread, but you're allowing all the so right now we do have synchronous functions that we need to implement, and so that is an issue.
You would be blocking the main thread of the worker. Like once you've got the WASM code running, it would be the thread loop in the worker that you would end up blocking.
Right. Although if you have a WASI instance with an exported function that's a synchronous function that's going to do some network work on the main event loop, you're going to need that function to be synchronous.
Right. So that's why, like, I don't know if in Node we would ever want to start WASM on the, like, I guess once there'd be two reasons. Like one, if it's actually like consuming the thread loop and nothing else can run, you don't want that on the main thread, right? So that would be one reason why we wouldn't want WASM to ever run on the main thread, just on the worker threads. The other thing that comes to mind is, if you're running on the main thread and you have multiple WASM things running, they're sharing the same heap, and things like that. So again, putting them out on the worker thread might give you a little bit more separation.
So it's very much the sort of goals of the component model to solve that intercomponent thing. And so it will end up being first class promise integration, and JSPI as it's called. But because of the fact that in the component model, you don't share memory, it's a shared nothing boundary. And so you don't need to do that kind of separation, but therefore we must figure out how to solve that threading story. And it will definitely not be ideal on Preview 2 because of the syncification. But I think there should be a path to a Preview 3 that can integrate more naturally with the event loop. But figuring out those exact details is going to be super important. But yeah, the worker scenario is still, is definitely a scenario, but saying that that's the only way to kind of do this stuff, I think, would be a little bit of a
yeah. No, I'm just thinking though, I was just thinking that you may want to always use a worker thread, but it comes down to what goals you're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like picking the right tool for the job, but the better integration we have, the easier the process will go. So if folks can put some thought to that, that would be really valuable. We have the current WebAssembly promise integration spec on the WebAssembly, the main WebAssembly proposal for that. And then we have this poll one-off right now, which is blocking, and we have plans for async, which will be the big thing for next year. And so somehow we need to tie that all up with the JS event loop. And yeah, I don't have a clear picture of it currently myself. I will certainly share as I figure it out.
Yep. Yeah, no, thanks. Was that all you want to share, or?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Okay, that takes us to the end of the agenda then. Is there anything else we should chat about before we close out? Okay, if not, well, thanks both Guy and Oscar for your updates, and it's always interesting to hear what's going on that front. And I'll talk to everybody next time. Thanks.